Maya Rodriguez had been staring at her bank account for the past 20 minutes and the numbers weren't getting any better. $347. That was all she had left after paying her bills last month. The email from her landlord sat in her inbox like a ticking time bomb. Rent was going up again, $400 more per month starting next month. She couldn't afford it. Not even close. She was 32 years old and felt like she was moving backward in life. For the past 6 years, she'd been working as a freelance graphic designer, taking whatever projects came her way. Some months were good, most months were just okay. But lately the work had been drying up, and the cost of everything kept climbing higher and higher. Her tiny apartment in the city, the one she'd called home for 3 years, was about to become impossible to keep. Maya had spent the last 2 months looking for something, anything she could afford. She'd scrolled through hundreds of rental listings, each one making her heart sink a little more. Studio apartments that cost more than her entire monthly income. Rooms for rent in houses with 5 other people. Basement apartments with no windows. Nothing worked. Nothing fit her budget. She was running out of options, and the anxiety was starting to keep her up at night. It was a Tuesday afternoon when she found the listing. She'd been scrolling through her phone, half watching a show on her laptop, clicking through page after page of rentals she couldn't afford. Then something caught her eye. It wasn't a rental. It was a sale listing, but the price made her stop scrolling immediately. $500, not 500,000. Just 500. She sat up straight and read it again. Tiny home for sale. $500. Must sell immediately. Relocating for work. Serious inquiries only. The listing had been posted just 2 hours earlier. There were only 3 photos, and they were so blurry she could barely make out what the place looked like. One showed what seemed to be a small wooden structure. Another showed a patch of land with some trees. The third was just a close-up of a door handle. Maya's first thought was that it had to be a scam. Nobody sold a home for $500. It didn't matter how small it was. But something made her click on the contact information anyway. The listing said the property was about 3 hours away in a small town she'd never heard of. She looked it up on the map. Millbrook, population 2,000, middle of nowhere. She called her best friend Lisa that evening. "I think I'm losing my mind," Maya said. "I'm actually considering driving 3 hours to look at a $500 house." "It's definitely a scam," Lisa said without hesitation. "Come on, Maya, think about it. $500? They probably just want to get you out there and rob you or something. I know. But what if it's real? What if it's just some old person who needs to move fast and doesn't know what things are worth? Then why wouldn't they list it for more? Even if they wanted a quick sale, they could get thousands for any property with land." Lisa had a point. Maya knew she had a point, but she also knew that her lease was ending in 6 weeks and she had nowhere to go. The desperate part of her brain was louder than the logical part. She sent a message to the seller through the listing platform. "Hi, I'm interested in viewing the property. When would be a good time?" The response came back in less than 10 minutes. "Tomorrow morning if possible. I'm leaving town by the end of the week. Address is 247 Oakwood Road, Millbrook. Can you come around 10? Maya read the message 3 times. It felt real. The person wasn't asking for money up front. They weren't being pushy, just direct and straightforward. She wrote back, "I'll be there at 10. She barely slept that night. Part of her was convinced she was about to drive 3 hours to an empty lot or worse. But another part of her, the part that was tired of scrolling through impossible rental listings, kept thinking about the possibility. What if it was real? What if this was the break she desperately needed? She left her apartment at 6:30 the next morning. The drive took her out of the city, through suburbs that gradually gave way to farmland and forests. She passed through small towns with names she'd never heard before. With each mile, her phone signal got weaker and her doubts got stronger. What was she doing? This was ridiculous. Millbrook appeared suddenly after a curve in the road. It was the kind of town that had one main street with a diner, a hardware store, and a post office. Everything else seemed to be houses spread out along winding roads. Maya followed her GPS down Oakwood Road, a narrow street lined with tall trees. The houses here were spaced far apart, each one sitting on at least an acre of land. Number 247 was at the end of a gravel driveway. Maya pulled in slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. And there it was, a tiny home. An actual tiny home. It wasn't some pile of junk or an empty lot. It was a real structure, sitting on a piece of land surrounded by trees. The home was small, maybe 200 square feet at most. The wooden siding had seen better days, with paint peeling in several spots. But it had a door, windows, and a small covered porch. It looked old but solid. Not fancy, not modern, but real. An older man was standing on the porch waving at her. He had white hair and was wearing work clothes that had seen a lot of use. Maya got out of her car, feeling suddenly nervous. "You must be Maya," he said, walking down to meet her. "I'm Robert Henderson. Thanks for coming all this way." "Thanks for meeting me," Maya said, shaking his hand. "I have to admit I wasn't sure this was real." Robert laughed, a tired sound. "I don't blame you. My daughter thinks I'm crazy for selling it so cheap. But I'm 74 years old and I just got a call that my other daughter is sick. Real sick. She lives in Oregon and I need to get out there as fast as I can. I inherited this place from my uncle about 5 years ago, but I never lived here. Never even stayed overnight. I kept meaning to fix it up or sell it properly, but life got in the way." He gestured toward the tiny home. "I just need it gone so I can leave. I don't have time for real estate agents or showings or any of that. I posted it online yesterday and you're the first person who actually showed up. If you want it, it's yours for $500. I've got the deed in my truck. We can drive to the county office right now and transfer it." Maya felt dizzy. This was happening. This was actually happening. "Can I look inside first?" "Of course. Let me show you around." Robert unlocked the door and they stepped inside. The space was cramped but surprisingly clean. There was a small kitchen area with a sink, a 2-burner stove, and a mini fridge. A compact bathroom with a toilet and shower. A main living area that could fit a couch and maybe a small table. And above, accessible by a ladder, a loft space for sleeping. It wasn't much. The floorboards creaked. The walls needed fresh paint. But it was solid. It was real. And it could be hers. "The land is about a 1/4 acre, Robert said. "Property taxes are cheap out here. Maybe $600 a year. There's a well for water and a septic system that was updated about 10 years ago. Electric hookup works fine." Maya walked around the space, her mind racing. She thought about her $347 in the bank. She thought about her landlord's email. She thought about another month of searching for apartments she couldn't afford. "I'll take it," she heard herself say. Robert smiled, looking relieved. "Let's go do the paperwork then." 2 hours later, Maya was standing outside the county records office, holding a deed with her name on it. She owned a home. A tiny, beat-up home in the middle of nowhere, but it was hers. She'd paid $500 in cash, signed what felt like 100 forms, and now she was a property owner. She drove back to the tiny home and sat on the porch steps, looking out at the trees. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lisa. "Are you still alive? Please tell me you didn't actually give someone money." Maya took a photo of herself holding the deed and sent it back. "I'm a homeowner." Her phone rang immediately. "You're joking?" "I'm not joking. It's real, Lisa. It's actually real." She could hear the disbelief in her friend's voice. "I'm coming to see this place this weekend. This is insane." Maya ended the call and sat in the quiet. Birds were singing somewhere in the trees. The air smelled like pine and dirt and possibility. She had no furniture to move in. No real plan. But she had a home. And for the first time in months, she felt like maybe things were going to be okay. She had no idea what she was about to discover beneath her feet. Maya spent the next 3 days going back and forth between her city apartment and her new tiny home in Millbrook. Each trip felt surreal, like she was living in 2 different worlds. In the city, she was the broke freelancer about to lose her apartment. In Millbrook, she was a homeowner with a fresh start ahead of her. She didn't have much to move. 6 years of city living had taught her to keep things minimal. A futon that doubled as her couch and bed. A small desk where she worked. Boxes of clothes. Kitchen supplies. Her laptop and camera equipment for work. All of it fit into her old sedan with room to spare. When she made her final trip on Sunday evening, locking her apartment door for the last time, she felt a strange mix of relief and terror. The first night sleeping in the tiny home was rough. Every sound felt amplified. The wind rattled the windows. The floorboards creaked when she shifted in her sleeping bag on the loft. Somewhere outside, an owl kept hooting every few minutes. She lay there in the darkness, wondering if she'd made a huge mistake. But when morning came and sunlight streamed through the small windows, warming the wooden walls, she felt a little better. This was hers. Nobody could raise her rent. Nobody could kick her out. She spent the entire next week cleaning. The place wasn't dirty exactly, but it had that stale smell of somewhere that hadn't been lived in for years. She scrubbed every surface, washed the windows until they sparkled, and swept out cobwebs from the corners. She bought a gallon of warm cream-colored paint from the hardware store in town and spent 2 days painting the walls. The transformation was remarkable. What had looked dim and tired suddenly felt bright and cozy. Her neighbor from across the road, an older woman named Patricia, stopped by on the 3rd day with a plate of cookies. "Heard someone finally bought the Henderson place," she said, looking Maya up and down with curious eyes. "Didn't think anyone would ever live here again." "It's perfect for me," Maya said, inviting her in. "Small and affordable." Patricia looked around the freshly painted interior and nodded approvingly. "You're fixing it up nice." Old Henderson barely ever came by. His uncle lived here years ago, but that was ages back. Place has been sitting empty since, 98? Maybe longer. After Patricia left, Maya felt a little less alone. Over the next few days, a few other neighbors introduced themselves. The couple next door brought over extra vegetables from their garden. The guy down the road offered to help if she ever needed anything fixed. Small-town life was different. People actually knew their neighbors here. By the end of the 2nd week, Maya had the place set up the way she wanted it. Her futon fit perfectly against one wall. Her small desk sat under the window where she had the best light for work. She'd hung curtains, put down a cheap rug she found at a thrift store, and arranged her few belongings to make the space feel like home. She'd even landed 2 new design projects, which meant she could actually afford groceries and gas without panicking about her bank account. She was starting to feel settled, starting to believe this crazy decision might actually work out. It was a Friday evening when everything changed. Maya had been working all day on a logo design for a client, and her back was killing her from sitting hunched over her laptop. She stood up to stretch, walking around the small space to get her blood flowing. That's when she noticed something odd. The floorboards in the corner of the living area, near where her futon was positioned, sounded different when she stepped on them. Hollow. She stopped and stepped on them again, listening carefully. Definitely hollow. The other floorboards made a solid thud when she walked on them, but these ones echoed like there was empty space underneath. Maya knelt down and examined the boards more closely. They looked the same as all the others at first glance, but when she ran her fingers along them, she could feel tiny gaps, seams that formed a square pattern, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet. Her heart started beating faster. She pressed down on the boards and they shifted slightly. She grabbed a butter knife from her kitchen drawer and carefully worked it into one of the seams, prying gently. The board lifted up easier than she expected, revealing more boards underneath, but these ones were different. They were darker, older looking, and right in the center was a metal ring handle, rusty and ancient looking. Maya sat back on her heels, staring at it. A trapdoor. There was a trapdoor hidden under her floor. Robert Henderson had never mentioned anything about a basement or crawl space or whatever this was. Had he known about it? The place had been sitting empty for years. Maybe he'd never looked closely enough to find it. She grabbed the metal ring and pulled. The door was heavy and the hinges screamed in protest, but it opened, revealing a dark rectangular opening and the top of a wooden staircase descending into blackness. Cool, musty air drifted up from below. Maya's hands were shaking. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it down into the opening. She could see rough wooden stairs, maybe 8 or 10 of them, leading down to what looked like a dirt floor. The beam of her phone's light didn't reach far enough to show her how big the space was. Every horror movie she'd ever watched was playing in her head. This was how people died. Going down into creepy basements alone at night, but curiosity was burning through her veins. This was her house. She owned whatever was down there. She had to know. She tested the first step carefully, putting her weight on it slowly. The wood held. She took another step, then another, descending into the darkness with her phone held out in front of her. The air got cooler with each step. The smell of old wood and earth filled her nose. When she reached the bottom and panned her phone light around, her jaw dropped. It was a full basement. Not a crawl space, not a small storage area. An actual basement that seemed to stretch under most of the tiny home above. The ceiling was low, maybe 6 feet high, with exposed wooden beams. But the space was huge compared to what she'd expected, and it was full of stuff. Old wooden shelves lined two of the walls, packed with items she could barely make out in the dim light of her phone. She moved closer, her light revealing stacks of old books, vinyl records in faded sleeves, boxes labeled with dates written in faded marker, 1952, 1967, 1973. Against the far wall stood furniture covered in dusty white sheets. She pulled one sheet away and found herself looking at a beautiful wooden desk with carved details along the edges, the kind of furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum or an expensive antique store. She pulled away another sheet and discovered a set of dining chairs with worn velvet cushions. Maya's phone light caught something else in the corner. Paintings, at least a dozen of them, leaning against the wall facing backward. She carefully turned one around and found herself staring at an oil painting of a coastal scene. The paint cracked with age, but the colors still vibrant. It was signed in the corner, though she couldn't read the name in the dim light. There were boxes everywhere. Some were cardboard, deteriorating at the edges. Others were old leather suitcases with brass clasps. She opened one and found it full of old photographs, hundreds of them, showing places she didn't recognize, beaches and mountains and foreign cities, old cars and people in vintage clothing smiling at the camera. Another box held what looked like journals, leather-bound books filled with handwritten pages. She picked one up carefully and opened it to a random page. The date at the top read July 15, 1962. The handwriting was elegant, flowing across the page in blue ink. Arrived in Paris this morning after 3 days at sea. The city is everything I dreamed it would be and more. Maya realized she was holding her breath. Someone had lived here. Someone who traveled and collected things and wrote about their adventures. Someone whose entire life seemed to be stored in this hidden basement. And Robert Henderson had sold her the property for $500 without knowing any of this existed. She spent the next 2 hours exploring, barely able to process what she was seeing. There were old cameras, vintage clothing and garment bags, sets of fine china wrapped in newspaper from the 1970s. Everywhere she looked, there was something new to discover. The beam of her phone kept getting dimmer as the battery drained, finally forcing her to climb back up the stairs. She sat on her floor next to the open trap door, her mind racing. What had she found? Whose things were these? And more importantly, what was she supposed to do about it? The property was legally hers now. Did that mean everything in the basement was hers too? She thought about calling Robert Henderson, but it was almost midnight. She thought about calling Lisa, but what would she even say? She'd found a secret basement full of someone's entire life? Maya closed the trapdoor and pushed her futon back over it. She'd deal with this in the morning. But as she lay in her loft trying to sleep, her mind wouldn't stop spinning. She kept thinking about those journals, those photographs, those paintings. Someone's story was hidden under her floor, and she'd just stumbled into it. She had no idea that by morning she'd be starting a journey that would change everything, not just for her, but for the memory of a woman she'd never met. A woman named Eleanor Whitmore, who'd lived a life most people only dreamed about. But that discovery would have to wait until the sun came up. Maya woke up the next morning convinced she'd dreamed the whole thing. But when she climbed down from the loft and saw her futon pushed slightly to the side, revealing the edge of the trapdoor, reality came flooding back. There was a basement under her floor, a basement full of someone else's life. She made coffee and sat at her desk, staring at the spot where the door was hidden. The logical thing to do was call Robert Henderson and tell him what she'd found. But something stopped her. He'd sold her the property. He'd signed over the deed. Legally, didn't that mean everything on the property was hers now? She wasn't sure, and the uncertainty made her stomach twist. Instead of calling him right away, Maya decided to do some research first. She needed to know whose things were in that basement and how they'd ended up there. She opened her laptop and started searching for information about the property, the address, the land records, anything she could find. The county website had basic property records going back about 30 years, but they didn't tell her much. Robert Henderson had inherited the property in 2020 from someone named George Henderson. Before that, the trail went cold online. She needed to dig deeper. Maya drove into town and found the Millbrook Public Library, a small brick building on Main Street that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1960s. Inside, a librarian named Dorothy sat at the front desk reading a paperback novel. She looked up when Maya entered, smiling warmly. "Can I help you find something, dear?" "I'm trying to research the history of a property," Maya said. The house at 247 Oakwood Road. I just bought it and I'm curious about who lived there before. Dorothy's eyes lit up. Oh, you bought the old Whitmore place. I heard someone finally did. That property sat empty for years after Eleanor passed. Maya's heart jumped. Eleanor? Eleanor Whitmore. That's right. Eleanor Whitmore. She was quite a character around here. Lived in that little house for, must have been 50 years or more. She passed away back in 98, I believe. Maybe 99. I can't quite remember. Did you know her? Dorothy nodded, setting down her book. Everyone knew Eleanor. She wasn't from here originally. Showed up sometime in the late 40s after the war and bought that land. Built that little house herself, or at least helped build it. She was a writer, you know. Traveled all over the world and wrote about it. Had her articles published in magazines and newspapers. She'd disappear for months at a time, then come back with the most incredible stories. Maya felt goosebumps rising on her arms. Do you know what happened to her things after she died? I'm not entirely sure. She didn't have any children, no husband. I think the property went to some nephew or cousin she barely knew. I remember there was some talk about an estate sale, but I don't think it ever happened. Why do you ask? Maya hesitated. I found some old items in the house. I'm trying to figure out what to do with them. Well, if they were Eleanor's, they might be worth looking into. She collected all sorts of interesting things from her travels. Hold on a moment. Dorothy disappeared into the back room and returned a few minutes later with a cardboard box. These are some old newspapers and magazines from the archives. I think there are a few articles about Eleanor in here. You're welcome to look through them. Maya spent the next 3 hours sitting at a library table, going through yellowed newspapers and old magazines. She found article after article written by Eleanor Whitmore, stories about post-war Europe, features on emerging cultures in Southeast Asia, travel essays about South America in the 60s. The woman had been everywhere and her writing was beautiful, vivid and honest and full of life. There was a profile piece about her from 1975 in a regional magazine. It included a photo of Eleanor standing in front of her tiny home, probably in her 50s at the time, with short gray hair and a confident smile. The article described her as a pioneering female journalist who'd made her career at a time when most newsrooms wouldn't hire women for anything beyond society. Pages. Maya took photos of every article with her phone. When she finally left the library, her head was spinning with information. Eleanor Whitmore had been real. She'd been accomplished and adventurous and had chosen to live in that tiny home in the middle of nowhere. And for some reason, all her belongings had been left in that basement, forgotten and untouched for more than 25 years. That afternoon, Maya called Robert Henderson. Her hands were shaking as she dialed his number. Hello? His voice sounded tired. Hi, Mr. Henderson, this is Maya Rodriguez. I bought your property in Millbrook last week. Oh yes, Maya, is everything all right with the house? The house is fine. But I found something and I need to talk to you about it. Did you know there was a basement? There was a long pause. A basement? No, I didn't know that. I only went inside that place twice, maybe 3 times. Just enough to make sure it wasn't falling apart. Why? Maya took a deep breath. There's a hidden trapdoor under the floorboards. It leads to a full basement and it's filled with belongings. Furniture, books, paintings, boxes of personal items. I think they belong to Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who lived there before your uncle. Another pause, longer this time. I had no idea. My Uncle George barely talked about that place. He inherited it from his mother's side of the family but never lived there. I didn't even know who Eleanor Whitmore was until the lawyer mentioned her name when I got the property. So you never went down into the basement? I didn't even know it existed. Listen, Maya, you bought the property fair and square. I signed over the deed. Whatever's in that basement is legally yours now. I don't want any part of it. I'm in Oregon dealing with my daughter's medical situation. I don't have the time or energy to worry about a bunch of old stuff in a basement. Are you sure? Some of these things might be valuable. I'm sure. It's yours. Do whatever you want with it. Sell it, keep it, donate it. I don't care. I got exactly what I needed, which was to get rid of that property quickly so I could be with my daughter. You got a home for $500. Sounds like we both got what we needed. After they hung up, Maya sat on her porch steps, processing everything. The belongings were legally hers. Eleanor Whitmore's entire life, or at least what was left of it, now belonged to her. The responsibility of that felt enormous. She spent the rest of the day properly exploring the basement. This time she brought down a battery-powered camping lantern she'd bought at the hardware store, along with a notepad and pen. She wanted to document everything she found. She started with the journals. There were dozens of them, spanning from 1945 to 1997, each one filled with Eleanor's elegant handwriting, chronicling her travels, her thoughts, her life. Maya sat on the dirt floor and read passage after passage, falling into the story of a woman who'd lived exactly the way she wanted to. The photographs were even more incredible, thousands of them documenting decades of travel. Eleanor at the pyramids in Egypt. Eleanor with locals in a Vietnamese village. Eleanor on a boat somewhere in the Mediterranean. Each photo was dated and labeled on the back. The woman had documented everything. The boxes on the shelves contained even more treasures. Vintage cameras that looked like they belonged in a museum. Collections of coins from dozens of countries. Hand-carved wooden figures from various cultures. Everything was carefully stored, wrapped and protected as if Eleanor had known someone would find it someday. Maya examined the paintings more carefully in the better light. There were 15 of them, all originals. Some were landscapes, others were portraits. A few were abstract, each one signed by the artist. She recognized a couple of the names from her art history classes in college. These weren't just random paintings. They were real art. The furniture was equally impressive. Besides the carved wooden desk, there was a complete dining set, a beautiful wardrobe with inlaid wood designs, and several chairs that looked like they were from different parts of the world. Everything was old but well-maintained. Maya felt overwhelmed. She had no idea what any of this was worth, but she knew it had to be significant. Eleanor Whitmore had spent a lifetime collecting these things, and they'd been sitting in this basement, hidden and forgotten, for more than 25 years. She climbed back upstairs as the sun was setting and sat at her desk, thinking about what to do next. She needed help. Professional help. Someone who knew about antiques and art and could tell her what she actually had. She pulled out her phone and started searching for antique appraisers in the area. There was one in a town about 40 minutes away. She sent them an email explaining that she'd inherited a collection of items and needed someone to evaluate them. She didn't mention how she'd actually acquired them. That story was too complicated for an email. That night, Maya went back down to the basement with Eleanor's journals. She brought her sleeping bag and the camping lantern and sat in the corner, reading by the soft light. She read about Eleanor's first trip to Europe in 1948, about falling in love with a French painter who later died in a car accident, about hiking through Nepal in the 60s when few Western women would dare, about documenting civil rights movements and social changes and the evolution of cultures across decades. Eleanor Whitmore had lived an extraordinary life, and somehow Maya had stumbled into it. She felt a strange connection to this woman she'd never met. Maybe it was because they'd both lived in this same tiny space, or maybe it was because Eleanor had also chosen to live differently than everyone expected her to. As Maya climbed back up to her loft that night, she made a decision. Whatever these items were worth, she wasn't going to just sell everything and walk away. Eleanor's story deserved to be told. Her life deserved to be remembered. Maya just didn't know yet that the true value of what she'd found would change everything. Not just for her, but for this entire small town, and for Eleanor Whitmore's forgotten legacy. The antique appraiser responded to Maya's email within 2 days. His name was Vincent Chen, and he ran an estate appraisal business out of the next town over. He said he could come by on Thursday afternoon if that worked for her. Maya spent the days leading up to his visit organizing the basement as best she could, grouping similar items together and taking inventory of everything she'd found. Minette's full of local history records. Eleanor donated some of her papers to the library years before she died. Letters, some early manuscripts, things like that. We've never had the funding to properly catalog or display them. They're just sitting in these files. Maya spent hours going through the files. She found letters Eleanor had written to editors, pitching story ideas. Rejection letters and acceptance letters. Early drafts of articles with handwritten edits. A letter from 1973, where Eleanor wrote about feeling invisible as an older woman in journalism, but refusing to stop writing. There was a folder labeled Personal Correspondence that contained letters from readers who'd been inspired by Eleanor's work. Women writing to thank her for showing them that it was possible to live unconventionally. Young journalists asking for advice. People from all over the world who'd been touched by her stories. Maya photographed everything, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. This woman had mattered. She'd made a difference, and somehow after she died, she'd been forgotten. Her belongings left in a basement, her story untold. That afternoon, Maya sat in her tiny home with Eleanor's journals spread around her and made a decision. She wasn't going to just sell everything. She was going to do something bigger, something that would honor Eleanor's life and legacy. She opened her laptop and started making notes. Ideas flowed faster than she could type them. She thought about the historical society Dorothy had mentioned, about the library's lack of funding, about the women who'd written letters thanking Eleanor for inspiring them. By evening, Maya had the outline of a plan. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious, but it felt right. She'd keep some items that felt personally meaningful. She'd sell others to fund what she wanted to create. And she'd make sure Eleanor Whitmore's name wasn't forgotten. She called Vincent the next day. I want to move forward with appraising and selling some of the items, but not all of them. And I want to do it strategically. Can you help me with that? It would be preserved. The most valuable paintings would go to auction. Some of the furniture would be sold to collectors, but other pieces, the personal items, the journals, the photographs, those would be saved for something else. News of the discovery started spreading through Millbrook. People were fascinated by the story of the hidden basement and the forgotten journalist. The local newspaper ran an article about it, and suddenly Maya was getting calls from people who'd known Eleanor, who remembered her, who had stories to share. An older man named Frank called to tell her that Eleanor had encouraged his daughter to pursue journalism when everyone else had told her to be a teacher. A woman named Helen said Eleanor had been the only person who'd made her feel brave enough to travel alone in the 70s. Every story made Maya more certain that she was doing the right thing. Eleanor Whitmore had lived a life worth remembering, and Maya was going to make sure people remembered it. The auction happened on a cold Saturday morning in November, 3 months after Maya had discovered the basement. She stood in the back of the auction house watching as people bid on Eleanor's paintings. The first one sold for $18,000. The second went for $22,000. By the time the last painting was sold, Maya's hands were shaking. Vincent found her after the auction ended. The total from today after fees comes to just over $93,000. Combined with what we got from the furniture sales last month, you're sitting at about $147,000. Maya nodded, trying to process the number. It still didn't feel real. 3 months ago, she'd had $300 in her bank account. Now she had more money than she'd ever imagined having. Are you sure about what you're planning to do with it? Vincent asked gently. That's a life-changing amount of money. You could invest it, buy a bigger house, secure your future. I'm sure, Maya said. And she was. The first thing she did was pay off every penny of debt she had. Credit cards, student loans, everything. The feeling of seeing those balances hit zero was almost overwhelming. For the first time in her adult life, she owed nothing to anyone. Next, she hired a contractor to properly renovate the tiny home. New plumbing, updated electrical, better insulation, fresh paint inside and out. She had them build a small addition that gave her a proper workspace and a real bedroom instead of just the loft. The house was still small, but it was comfortable and truly hers. But the real project was what she'd been planning since that day in the library. Maya used $60,000 to establish the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation. It was set up to provide scholarships for young women pursuing careers in journalism, travel writing, or documentary work. The first year, they'd be able to fund 3 full scholarships. As the foundation grew, they could fund more. She donated Eleanor's journals, photographs, and personal papers to the Millbrook Historical Society, along with a $15,000 grant to help them create a proper archive and exhibition space. The Historical Society had been operating out of someone's garage for years. Now they'd have funding to rent a small building downtown and preserve local history properly. The exhibition they created was called Eleanor Whitmore, A Life in Motion. It opened on a Saturday in March, almost exactly 1 year after Maya had bought the tiny home. The entire town seemed to show up. People Maya had never met came up to her with tears in their eyes, thanking her for bringing Eleanor's story back to life. Dorothy from the library hugged her tightly. You've done something wonderful, dear. Eleanor would be so proud. Frank, the man whose daughter Eleanor had encouraged to pursue journalism, brought that daughter with him. She was in her 60s now, a retired newspaper editor. I never got to thank her properly, she told Maya. She changed my life. What you're doing, keeping her memory alive, it matters more than you know. The exhibition was beautiful. Large photographs of Eleanor at different stages of her life lined the walls. Display cases held some of her cameras, a few of her journals open to particularly beautiful passages, and items from her travels. A video screen played a slideshow of the thousands of photographs she'd taken around the world, but Maya's favorite part was a simple wooden bench placed in the center of the room. Mounted on the wall behind it was a quote from one of Eleanor's journals. Written in 1965, "I've learned that a full life isn't measured by the size of your home or the amount of money in your bank account. It's measured by the richness of your experiences, the depth of your curiosity, and the courage to live exactly as you choose." Maya read those words at least once a week. They'd become something like a personal mantra. The local newspaper did a feature story about the whole thing. The hidden basement, the discovery, the decision to honor Eleanor's legacy instead of just cashing in. The story got picked up by a regional magazine, then a national news website. Suddenly, Maya was doing interviews, telling Eleanor's story over and over. A filmmaker from the city reached out, wanting to make a short documentary about Eleanor's life and Maya's discovery. They spent 2 weeks in Millbrook, interviewing people who'd known Eleanor, filming the tiny home and the exhibition. The documentary premiered at a small film festival 6 months later and won an award for Best Short Documentary. But the best moment came when a woman in her 70s showed up at Maya's door one afternoon. She introduced herself as Christine Miller, and she'd been Eleanor's friend in the 1970s and 80s. "I lost touch with her in the 90s, Christine said, sitting on Maya's porch with a cup of tea. "I moved away and we didn't have email back then. Phone calls were expensive. By the time I tried to reconnect, I found out she'd passed. I always felt guilty about that." She told Maya stories about Eleanor that weren't in any of the journals. About Eleanor's sense of humor, her stubbornness, her kindness. About the time Eleanor had driven 6 hours to be with Christine after her divorce, staying for a week to help her get back on her feet. She had this saying, Christine said with a sad smile. She'd say, "We're not put on this earth to collect things. We're here to collect experiences," and she lived by that. Even though she had all those beautiful things in her home, they were never what mattered to her. It was the stories behind them. After Christine left, Maya went down to the basement. She'd kept it mostly empty now, with just a few of Eleanor's belongings that she couldn't bear to part with. The leather trunk with the travel stickers, a small collection of the journals, some of her favorite photographs. She sat on the floor in the quiet, thinking about everything that had happened. A year and a half ago, she'd been desperate and broke, clicking on a listing that seemed too good to be true. She'd driven 3 hours on a hope, handed over her last $500 and bought a tiny home from a stranger. She'd expected to get shelter, maybe a fresh start. She'd never expected to find purpose. The scholarship fund had already changed lives. The first 3 recipients were young women from low-income families who never could have afforded journalism school otherwise. One of them had written Maya a letter saying she felt like Eleanor herself was watching over her, pushing her to chase her dreams. Maya's own life had transformed too. The documentary had led to freelance opportunities she never would have gotten otherwise. Companies wanted to hire the designer who'd found the hidden basement and honored a stranger's legacy instead of just taking the money. Her income had stabilized. She wasn't rich, but she was comfortable and secure. More importantly, she'd found community in Millbrook, real friendships, a sense of belonging she'd never had in the city. Patricia next door checked on her regularly. Dorothy invited her to book club. Frank and his daughter had her over for dinner once a month. She'd also started writing. Nothing professional, just personal essays about the experience, about Eleanor, about what it means to live deliberately. A few had been published in small magazines. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but it felt right. One evening in late spring, Maya was sitting on her porch watching the sunset when Lisa's car pulled into the driveway. Her best friend had driven up for the weekend, making good on her promise to visit regularly. "I brought wine," Lisa called out, holding up a bottle. They sat on the porch as the sky turned pink and orange. Lisa looked around at the renovated tiny home, the flower garden Maya had planted, the peaceful setting. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving away most of that money? You could be living in a mansion somewhere right now." Maya thought about it, really thought about it. No, she said finally. I don't regret any of it. I have enough. More than enough. And I got to do something that actually matters. How many people can say that? Lisa clinked her wine glass against Maya's. You're either the wisest person I know or completely crazy. Maybe both, Maya said with a laugh. Later that night, after Lisa had gone to bed in the guest loft, Maya sat at her desk reading one of Eleanor's journals by lamplight. It was from 1989, one of the last ones Eleanor had written. The entry talked about getting older, about wondering what would happen to all the things she'd collected, all the stories she'd documented. I hope someone finds these someday, Eleanor had written. I hope they understand that these objects aren't just things. They're proof that I lived fully, that I chose adventure over comfort, experience over security. I hope whoever finds them knows they can make the same choice, that it's never too late to live the life you're meant to live. Maya closed the journal and looked around her small home, at the desk where she worked, creating designs and writing essays, at the walls she'd painted herself, at the life she'd built with $500 and a lot of luck. She thought about Eleanor, living in this same space decades ago, making the same choice to live differently than everyone expected. Two women, separated by time, connected by courage and circumstance and a hidden basement full of treasures. Maya pulled out her own journal, the one she'd started keeping after finding Eleanor's. She wrote about the day, about Lisa's visit, about the constant feeling of gratitude that had become part of her daily life. And at the bottom of the page, she wrote, "Thank you, Eleanor, for showing me that a small life can hold infinite richness, for reminding me that we get to choose what matters, for leaving behind proof that courage and curiosity are worth more than any amount of money." She closed the journal and climbed up to her loft. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the dark sky. Tomorrow she'd wake up in her tiny home, the one she'd bought for $500. She'd work on her projects, tend to her garden, maybe write another essay about Eleanor. It wasn't the life she'd planned. It was so much better than anything she could have planned. And it all started because she'd been brave enough to take a chance on something that seemed impossible, just like Eleanor had done over and over again for 50 years. The tiny home creaked softly in the night breeze. Maya smiled in the darkness and fell asleep, dreaming of all the adventures still to come.